Picture this. You're standing in Norway, 500 years after Christ. It's January. The sun hasn't shown its face in 6 weeks, and won't for another 6. The temperature? We're talking about the kind of cold where spit freezes before it hits the ground, where exposed skin turns black with frostbite in the time it takes to walk from one building to another. This is the world where Viking women didn't just survive, they thrived. And they did it by doing something that seems almost counterintuitive to us modern folks. When winter tried to kill them on the surface, they went underground. Now, you might think, wait a minute, underground? In Scandinavia? That frozen wasteland where the ground turns to permafrost? But here's where it gets interesting. These women discovered something that bears and foxes had known for millennia. Just below that frost line, maybe 6 feet down, the Earth maintains a constant temperature. We're talking about 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. When it's -20 on the surface, that's a 70-degree difference. That's the difference between death and comfort, between extinction and civilization. The story really begins with a woman named Astrid of Trondheim. And folks, this is where history gets personal. In 792 after Christ, during what the sagas call the Winter of White Death, Astrid lost 3 children. 3. Can you imagine? The cold came so fast, so brutal, that entire families were found frozen in their beds. The surviving records, and these are contemporary accounts, mind you, describe children's bodies so perfectly preserved by the cold that mothers tried to warm them back to life for days, not accepting they were gone. Standing over those small frozen bodies, Astrid made a vow that would change Scandinavian society forever. No mother, she swore, would suffer this loss again. Not if she could help it. And here's where Astrid does something brilliant. Instead of trying to build better surface structures, which is what the men were doing, by the way, with limited success, she starts studying animals. Think about that for a second. This grieving mother spends the entire following summer tracking bears to their dens, watching foxes dig burrows, and most importantly, investigating why the ancient burial mounds, some of them centuries old, never froze solid, even in the deepest winter. On the summer solstice of 793, Astrid begins her first excavation. She chooses a south-facing hillside, and this is crucial where the earth was dry and the bedrock lay deep. The other women in her village? They thought she'd lost her mind with grief. Here's this woman, covered in dirt, disappearing into a hole in the ground every day. But when the first frost came that autumn, Astrid invites the skeptics into her underground chamber. The sagas describe their amazement. While their breath formed clouds in their above-ground homes, Astrid's underground space was warm enough that children could play without their heavy furs. Word of Astrid's innovation spread faster than a Viking raid. And I mean that literally. The trading networks that carried amber and silver also carried this life-saving knowledge. Within a generation, women across Scandinavia were incorporating sophisticated blessing ceremonies before each excavation. They'd call upon Frigg, the goddess of foresight, because you needed foresight to survive those winters, and Jorth, the Earth Mother herself. But here's what's fascinating. This wasn't just religious ceremony. These rituals were teaching tools. The women developed an entire vocabulary for reading soil. Clay meant waterproofing challenges, but excellent insulation. Sandy soil required extensive timber reinforcement, but drained naturally. The volcanic soil of Iceland, that stuff could be carved like soft stone when wet, but hardened like iron when it dried. They learned to taste the earth literally, put it on their tongues to determine mineral content and stability. Norwegian women became master granite workers, developing tools that could cut through solid rock. Swedish builders perfected pine tar waterproofing techniques that wouldn't be improved upon for another 500 years. Danish women, dealing with lowland water tables, created drainage systems that would make Roman engineers jealous. By 850 after Christ, just 2 generations after Astrid's first excavation, no Viking settlement existed without its network of underground shelters. Think about that transformation. In 60 years, an entire civilization redesigned its survival strategy. And here's the kicker. The women who controlled these shelters? They held the power of life and death in their soil-stained hands. When winter came, Access to these underground spaces meant the difference between watching your children play in warm, torchlit chambers or holding their frozen bodies come spring. The men might have controlled the surface world, with their longships and their raids and their warrior halls. But when the winter darkness descended and the surface world became a frozen hell, real power belonged to the women who had mastered the underground. They decided who sheltered where, who had access to the warmest chambers, whose food stores would be protected from the killing frost. In a world where one bad winter could erase entire bloodlines, these women had become the architects of survival itself. But if you think building individual family shelters was impressive, wait until you hear what happened during the Winter of Three Moons, when one woman named Gudrun Ironhand decided that connecting these individual shelters into vast underground cities might just be possible. 850 after Christ, the year everything changed. Gudrun Iron Hand, and yes, that was really her name, stands at the entrance of her family's shelter, looking at the adjacent hillside, where 5 other shelter entrances dot the landscape like mysterious dark eyes. She has an idea that seems insane even by Viking standards. What if, she thinks, instead of individual family shelters, we connected them all? What if we built a city underground? Now, to understand why this was revolutionary, you have to grasp the scale we're talking about here. Gudrun wasn't proposing a few tunnels between neighbours. She was imagining an underground complex that would eventually span nearly a mile, with 37 interconnected chambers, some large enough to hold 50 people. This is Bronze Age engineering attempting Space Age ambition, and she pulls it off. The catalyst was the Winter of Three Moons, and before you ask, yes, they really called it that because the full moon came and went 3 times while snow fell continuously. 90 straight days of snowfall. Can you even imagine? Villages disappeared under 20-foot drifts. The surface world essentially ceased to exist. But here's where it gets incredible. 5 villages of women, nearly 300 builders in total, had spent the previous autumn following Gudrun's vision. While the men prepared for raids that would never come because nobody could move in that snow, these women moved Earth. They created what the Skalds would later call the underground kingdom of Vestfold. And folks, when I say kingdom, I'm not exaggerating. The ventilation shafts were disguised as sacred standing stones. Genius, right? Who's going to mess with a religious monument? Emergency exits hidden beneath frozen streams that never fully froze because of the warm air flowing up from below. The engineering here is absolutely mind-blowing, but the really fascinating part? The social organization that emerged. These women developed specialized roles that sound like something out of fantasy literature, except they were absolutely real. The readers of Earth women who could determine soil stability by taste and touch. I'm not making this up. They could put soil on their tongue and tell you if it would hold or collapse, what minerals were present, whether water would be a problem. The smoke dancers designed ventilation systems that could warm 100 people without anyone suffocating from carbon monoxide. Try doing that without modern instruments. The water singers, and this is my favorite, could divine underground streams and manage complex drainage systems that kept these underground cities dry, despite being, underground. The main chambers were architectural marvels, carved pillars representing Yggdrasil, the world tree, with roots extending into the floor and branches spreading across the ceiling. Not just decoration, these pillars were load-bearing, distributing the weight of tons of earth and snow above. Children had designated tunnel systems where they could play safely. Think about that. While blizzards raged above, Viking children were playing tag in warm, torch-lit tunnels. These kids learned navigation skills down there that would later serve them on sea voyages. The skills transferred. Underground, or on the ocean, you needed to navigate without clear landmarks, understand 3-dimensional space, remember complex routes. Now here's where the power dynamics get really interesting. Women controlled access to survival itself. You want your family to live through winter? Better stay on good terms with the shelter managers. They established rules: no violence in the shelters, equal distribution of stored food, and mandatory contributions to the common fuel supply. Break the rules? You're back on the surface. In January, good luck with that. The economic implications were staggering. Shelter space became currency. Women traded access for silver, weapons, trade goods. They essentially created an underground economy, literally, that operated parallel to the male-dominated surface trade. And when conflict came, these shelters became fortresses. 973 after Christ, raiders attack the Trondheim settlement. The men prepare for glorious battle. The women and children, they vanish, just disappear into the earth like they never existed. The raiders burn the surface village, confident they'll smoke out the hiding families. Here's the thing though, those ventilation systems the smoke dancers designed, they could filter smoke while maintaining fresh airflow. The frustrated raiders spend a full month trying to force out the defenders. Meanwhile, the women are using hidden passages to strike at the raiders' supplies, stealing food, destroying weapons, and then disappearing again. The psychological warfare was brutal. Imagine being a raider, thinking you're fighting ghosts. Supplies disappear. Sentries report strange sounds from beneath the earth. You can't find the enemy to fight them. After a month, starving and demoralized, the raiders retreat. As they're leaving, the entire population emerges from concealed exits to reclaim their burned but still standing village. The shelters had won a bloodless victory. By 900 after Christ, these underground complexes weren't just shelters anymore. They were parallel civilizations. Above ground, men ruled through strength and violence. Below ground, women ruled through knowledge and resource control. And during those long, dark winters, guess which society was more important for survival? But the shelters were about to become something even more remarkable. Centers of medicine, spirituality, and cultural preservation that would define Viking society for the next century. 900 after Christ to 1000 after Christ. This is the century where Viking underground shelters stop being just about survival and become something else. Entirely complete societies with their own cultures, their own rules, their own secrets. And I mean secrets that were kept so well that we're only now, 1,000 years later, starting to understand what really went on down there. Let me paint you a picture of daily life in these shelters. The typical complex housed 3 to 4 extended families. We're talking 30 to 40 people, plus, and this is crucial, livestock. 6 to 8 cows, 20 sheep, countless chickens. Now, before you wrinkle your nose at the idea of living underground with animals, understand this. Those animals were heating units. A cow generates about 4,000 BTUs of heat per hour. 8 cows? That's the equivalent of a modern furnace. The women had figured out thermodynamics centuries before anyone could spell it. They created separate but connected chambers, animals in one section, humans in another, connected by airways that let the heat flow but kept the worst of the smell away. The animal waste, channeled through stone gutters carved into the bedrock, collected in underground chambers, composted through the winter. Come spring, they had the richest fertilizer in Scandinavia. Nothing was wasted. Everything had purpose. But here's where it gets really fascinating. The medical knowledge developed in these confined spaces was revolutionary. The women discovered that certain depths, usually about 12 feet down, maintained humidity levels that prevented the dreaded winter cough that killed so many on the surface. They found that specific cave mushrooms growing on the shelter walls had antibiotic properties. We've tested these mushrooms. They actually work. Children born underground during winter, they develop differently. Stronger lungs from the dense air, better night vision from the constant dim light. There was even a tradition that expectant mothers should descend into the shelters a month before giving birth. The stable temperature, the humidity, the calm environment, birth survival rates underground were significantly higher than on the surface. The psychological techniques for combating what we'd now call seasonal affective disorder were incredibly sophisticated. Structured storytelling sessions, where each person contributed to an ongoing saga, like a verbal Netflix series that lasted all winter. Communal crafting projects that produced trade goods for spring. Elaborate celebration cycles marking time when sun and stars were invisible. They created their own calendar down there, based on sleep cycles and activity patterns rather than celestial movements. But the real revelation, and this is something the Christian chroniclers later tried desperately to suppress, was that these shelters became centers of female spiritual authority. In the deepest chambers, far from male oversight, women maintained the old religious practices. They carved elaborate altar spaces dedicated to the Disir female protective spirits. They conducted coming-of-age ceremonies for girls that involved spending 3 days alone in specially prepared meditation chambers. We're talking about vision quests, underground, in absolute darkness. These same spaces served as informal courts where women adjudicated disputes. Marriage negotiations happened down here, trade agreements, political alliances. The men might have thought they were making the big decisions in their mead halls, but the real power brokering happened 40 feet underground, by candlelight, between women who controlled whether your family ate this winter. The knowledge preservation system was absolutely genius. Everything was encoded. Lullabies contained ventilation instructions: sing this song, follow its rhythm, and you're actually learning how to maintain proper airflow. Weaving patterns were maps of tunnel systems. Recipes included shelter maintenance schedules. Add wood to the fire when the soup boils wasn't just cooking advice, it was reminding you to check the ventilation when carbon monoxide might build up. One of the most remarkable events we know about happened in 998 after Christ. Ingrid, the wise mother, the most renowned shelter architect of her generation, died. Her funeral was held underground. Over 200 women attended, traveling through connected tunnel systems from 12 different villages. They moved through miles of tunnels, navigating by touch and memory, never seeing daylight. The funeral lasted 3 days. The sagas say no man ever learned what was said or done during those ceremonies. Think about the implications. These women had created a parallel society, physically beneath but socially beyond male authority. They had their own economy, their own governance, their own religion, their own justice system. When winter came, the surface world with its warrior culture and male dominance became literally frozen out. The real Viking society, the one that survived, that thrived, that passed on knowledge and culture, existed underground, managed by women, invisible to history until now. The shelters had become more than structures. They were temples, hospitals, schools, courts, and fortresses all at once. They were spaces where the temperature never changed, but society was transformed. Where darkness was constant, but illumination, real illumination, happened daily. But this golden age of underground civilization was about to face its greatest challenge. Christianity was coming to Scandinavia, and the church had very definite opinions about women gathering in dark places beyond the reach of male authority. The year 1000 after Christ. King Olaf of Norway accepts Christianity, and with that single decision, the 1000-year age of the great shelters begins its end. But, and this is crucial, it doesn't end immediately. It takes a full century for these underground kingdoms to finally fall silent, and the way Viking women navigated this transition? Absolutely brilliant. Enter Sigrid, the last keeper, born in 1020 after Christ. Her grandmother had been a master builder in the old tradition. Her mother had seen the first. Christian priests condemn the shelters as pagan hellmouths, literal entrances to the underworld where women conspired with demons. Sigrid grew up between two worlds, the ancient knowledge of underground construction and the new reality of Christian authority. And here's what she does. She becomes the chief architect of Nidaros Cathedral. Think about that for a second. This woman, trained in pagan underground building techniques, convinces the Christian bishops that holy ground requires the same careful soil reading, the same excavation expertise, the same understanding of structural engineering as the ancient shelters. She essentially Trojan horses pagan knowledge into Christian architecture. Brilliant. But the church faced a problem. They could condemn the shelters all they wanted, but when winter came, real winter, Viking winter ideology meant nothing. The terrible winter of 1047 after Christ proved this definitively. Snow fell for 40 straight days. Temperatures dropped so low that iron became brittle and shattered like glass. Even the most devout Christians fled underground to survive. The priests had two choices: adapt or watch their congregations freeze. So, they negotiated, and the compromise they reached tells you everything about the pragmatism of cultural transformation. The shelters could remain, but they had to be consecrated to Saint Barbara, patron saint of miners. Crosses replaced the traditional carved symbols. Christian prayers replaced pagan invocations on the surface. Because here's what actually happened. The women became expert at creating hidden chambers behind Christian facades. The shelter beneath Hedeby, we've excavated this, had a Christian chapel in its entry chamber. Beautiful, proper, decorated with crosses and images of saints. But if you knew where to look, behind a carved image of the Virgin Mary, there was a passage. Follow that passage down 3 levels, past 2 false walls, and you'd find a traditional sacred space dedicated to Frigg, goddess of foresight, maintained exactly as it had been for centuries. The knowledge preservation went underground in more ways than one. Women taught their daughters the old songs, but gave them new words. The ventilation instructions that used to invoke Odin's breath now talked about the Holy Spirit. Same rhythm, same information, different packaging. The soil reading techniques were preserved in cooking recipes that somehow required very specific descriptions of earth types. When making winter bread, seek soil that tastes of iron but not salt. That's not cooking advice. That's telling you how to identify stable ground for excavation. The last great shelter complex was completed in 1080 after Christ in Uppsala. Thorin Swanneck, the last of the great master builders, created something unprecedented. A hybrid structure that served as both Christian crypt and traditional shelter. On the surface, a proper Christian burial ground. Below, an underground complex that incorporated 3 centuries of accumulated engineering knowledge. The innovations in this final shelter were extraordinary. Self-cleaning water systems using underground stream pressure, basically indoor plumbing, 3 centuries before anyone else in Europe figured it out. Thermal mass walls that stored heat during the day and released it at night, maintaining stable temperatures for weeks. Acoustic designs that allowed whispers to travel between specific chambers while blocking sound between others. You could have a private conversation in one room while a feast was happening next door. When Thorin died in 1095 after Christ, the shelter building tradition effectively ended. Not because the knowledge was lost, it was deliberately discontinued. The Christian authorities finally had enough surface infrastructure to survive winters without going underground. The economic power of controlling shelter access had shifted to controlling church-sanctioned buildings. The age of the underground kingdoms was over. But here's the thing about knowledge, especially knowledge carved in stone and encoded in culture: it doesn't really die. It transforms. Modern archaeologists keep finding these shelters throughout Scandinavia. The organic materials preserved in them tell stories that surface ruins never could. A child's toy perfectly preserved. Textiles showing weaving techniques we're still trying to understand. Food remains that reveal diets and trade networks. Even more fascinating, the cultural echoes. Modern Norwegians practice kos, creating cozy, warm spaces during winter darkness. That's not just about comfort. That's ancestral memory of underground shelters. Swedish children play hiding games that mimic tunnel navigation exercises. Danish farmers still test soil by taste before building, following techniques Viking women developed 1200 years ago. The shelters themselves sleep beneath the earth. Their ventilation shafts, long collapsed, show up as circles of unusually green grass in otherwise uniform fields. Ground-penetrating radar reveals vast networks of tunnels beneath ordinary-looking Scandinavian towns. Most will never be excavated, too expensive, too complex, too much modern infrastructure above them. But they're there, waiting. These underground cathedrals, built by women whose names were erased from history, saved a civilization. They created a parallel society that valued knowledge over violence, cooperation over competition, survival over glory. They proved that sometimes the greatest strength isn't in fighting the world, but in understanding it so deeply that you can disappear into it and emerge stronger. The Viking Age is remembered for longships and raids, for warriors and conquest. But the real Viking Age, the one that mattered, the one that ensured there would be future generations to tell the tales, happened underground, in the warm darkness, where women built kingdoms beneath the snow and saved their people from winter's fury. Every time a Scandinavian child plays in a snow fort, every time someone creates a cozy space against winter darkness, Every time knowledge is preserved through story and song, the echo of those underground shelters reverberates through time. The shelters are silent now, but if you know how to listen in the way soil tastes, in the games children play, in the stories grandmothers tell, you can still hear the voices of the women who built kingdoms beneath the earth, who conquered winter not with swords but with shovels, who saved the Viking world by taking it underground.